My guest today is Gary Taubes. Gary is an award-winning science and health journalist, co-founder and director of the Nutrition Science Initiative. He's the author of The Case Against Sugar, Why We Get Fat, and most famously, Good Calories, Bad Calories. And he's a former staff writer for Discover and correspondent for the journal Science. He's written 3 cover articles on nutrition and health for the New York Times Magazine, and his writing has also appeared in The Atlantic, Esquire, and numerous best of anthologies, including the Best of Best American Science Writing in 2010. He received 3 Science and Society Journalism Awards from the National Association of Science Writers, and is also the recipient of a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Investigator Award in Health Policy Research. He lives in Oakland, California, with his wife and 2 boys. His new book is The Case for Keto. Here it is. Rethinking Weight Control and the Science and Practice of Low-Carb, High-Fat Eating. So this is a really fascinating conversation, and I think really important, not just for losing weight. Maybe you want to lose some weight, maybe not, but for longevity and overall health and how you feel. And he makes a pretty good case that the keto, or various versions of the keto diet, is really the good way to go. If nothing else, in the last 50 years, we've seen a gigantic spike in obesity. Now about 40% of all Americans are obese, and a huge spike corresponding with that of diabetes and heart disease that goes with it, and all the other subsequent complications. So obviously, we've been doing something wrong. Maybe we should try something different. In the end of the conversation, really, that's all Gary's trying to do is say, just consider it. Just give it a try and see how you feel. And I think that's a good recommendation. That was my take home from it as well. So with that, I give you Gary Taubes. Gary Taubes, welcome to the show. The new book is The Case for Keto. You know, I've been a longtime fan of your work, and the reason all the way back to the cold fusion book, Bad Science, because you know, one of the things we do at Skeptic is we track not just pseudoscience, but also bad science. And it's always an interesting question to me, how do scientists get it so wrong? So one of the aspects of the scientific method that I've been thinking a lot about recently is the idea of consensus, because none of us are smart enough to figure the world out on our own. We need other scientists. And to prevent you from going down, the rabbit hole of some crazy idea or go off the rails on something that just can't possibly be true, it's good to check it with other scientists to kind of keep you within the boundaries of normal debate and discussion of possible workable hypotheses for whatever it is you're interested in. Now, that's not to say that groups never get it wrong. They do, which just brings me to your work, because, when we think of like the theory of evolution or the Big Bang, cosmology or climate science, there's this idea that a community of professionals who work in that area, who are very competitive with each other, they try to debunk each other and so on. When they reach a consensus, you and I, as outsiders, can go, yeah, okay, I guess that's true about quantum physics or whatever. What do I know about quantum physics? Nothing. But, these 100 guys that do this for a living, this is all they do. They tell me this is the way it is. Okay, I kind of accept it, not on authority, but that I know the scientific process usually works. Which brings me to your work, because how is it possible that, for 50, 60, 70 years, maybe a century, you take it back to the 19th century, that these top, smart, hardworking, professional scientists in this area could have been so wrong?
Okay, so and hi, Michael. Good to be on your show again.
Yes.
Let's first talk about what the point that I'm making in this book, one of the many points I'm making, because you might think it's a diet book. It's as much about good science and bad science as my other books, and that cold fusion book was called Bad Science. So there's a few points. First of all, this idea that we get fat because we eat too much, which is the fundamental bedrock theory of obesity, right? It's the Newton's laws of obesity. We get fat because we take in more calories than we consume. That's wrong. Not only is it wrong, as Wolfgang Pauli would have said, it's not even wrong.
Right.
It's meaningless. And then from there, everything goes off the rails. So we end up with a dietary advice. If somebody's gaining weight, we tell them to eat less or eat not too much, like Michael Pollan tells us. If you're worried about heart disease, which if you're gaining weight, you should be worried about heart disease, and you're supposed to eat low fat. There are Mediterranean diets, and there's all kinds of, and the counter argument, the hypothesis, obesity it's not caused by eating too much. It's a hormonal regulatory disorder, and it's triggered by the hormone, dominated by the hormone insulin, which is the same hormone that's dysregulated in diabetes. And if you want to reduce the fat you're carrying, you got to lower your insulin levels. And if you do that maximally efficiently, the way you lower your insulin is you eat fewer carbohydrates, and then we get to ketogenic diets and keto. So that's kind of the train of bad science to good science. So
tell you about our sponsor, the Great Courses Plus app here. Great Courses app, which is free. You can download and watch or listen to lectures of hundreds of different courses. Each of them have dozens of lectures in them. This particular one is America's Struggle Against Slavery, which I completed this course. Well, most of the lectures, and this particular one has 30 different 30-minute lectures. You can listen to them at like 1.2 or 1.3 speed, so it brings it down to about 20 minutes a lecture, which is great. And so if you want to give it a try, you can get a free trial through my website or through this show at thegreatcoursesplus.com/Shermer. So if you want to get the free trial, and then also the it's $30 for you get the free trial plus the discount through the show, and it comes out to about $30 discounted for that, and so give it a try. And I listen to these lectures pretty much every day. I listen to at least one lecture a day in addition to the audiobooks I listen to.
Scientific method, right, is hypothesis and test. So science works very well when you could come up with a hypothesis and test it. And the easier it is to test it, and the quicker it is to test it, and the cheaper it is to test it, the better science works, because it's so easy to screw up an experiment. You want to be able to do it over and over and over and over again until you're absolutely positively convinced that you haven't made a mistake. And more often than not, scientists make mistakes. So that's, to me, this is where we start to go off the rails. When we get to fields that you can't do the experiments. Climate change, cosmology. Now you're left with, and nutrition, because of, we're talking about, then we'll get into this, the dietary causes of chronic diseases that develop over decades. So it's not like deficiency diseases like vitamin C and scurvy or vitamin B's and pellagra. You've got somebody suffering from a deficiency disease, you give them the vitamin you think is missing. If they get better, you've done the experiment. But here you've got these chronic diseases that develop over decades. And the idea is they're caused by eating too much of something, not too little of something. So it's virtually impossible to do the experiments. Once you can't do the experiments, you can't do this hypothesis and test thing that's integral to the scientific method. It just doesn't. And you end up basically taking a vote of what do people believe. And you hope the people who you're taking the vote from are so smart and so critical that they're aware of all the possible ways they could have fooled themselves. And so they're hedging their bets in all the proper ways, but that's not how human nature works. So I think that's a fundamental problem. As we move into sciences where you can't do hypothesis and test, you start relying on all kinds of secondary measures of validity, like consensus or modeling or,
well, you have
poison, what my friends think is true.
There's a lot of anecdotal thinking here that you would think scientists would not trust. But then there's something like the natural experiment method, say, that political scientists use. We can't force one country to be a democracy and another one to be an autocracy, but we can compare South Korea to North Korea to see what the outcomes were over decades in terms of their GDP or whatever we want to measure. What's the difficulty of doing that, let's say, with the so-called blue zones, where people seem to live longer? And so you go and study those people and see, well, what is it they're doing? Well, they eat a Mediterranean diet, they walk an hour a day, they write in journals every day, they have lots of friends and social networking. So you have a list of like a dozen things, but the problem is, well, which are the ones that are most effective? How would you rank
which are
them?
the ones, and
Yeah.
what you have is a dozen things that a very healthy population does. So you have an association between the health of the population and the things that they do that we tend not to do, and we're an unhealthy population. But you don't have, that's the association causality problem. You don't have any causal information. You don't know if they're healthy because they eat a Mediterranean-like diet. And of course, because these are unblinded assessments, right? The people who do the assessments tend to, I mean, let's talk about the experimental method for a moment. So there are certain absolute bedrock necessities for an experiment to be trustworthy. And these, we insist that these be the case when you do a pharmaceutical drug trial, right? So you want to make sure that neither the experimentalists nor the subjects are aware of what's being tested, or who's taking a drug and who's taking a placebo, because we're pretty confident that if they're aware, they'll bias their observation in favor of what they want to believe, right? So you need blinding and you need placebo controls. And if you don't have blinding, if the experimentalist knows what result he wants to get, he's probably going to get that result. And physicists in their literature and their memoirs will talk about this all the time. They talk about intellectual phase lock, where the entire communities get locked into believing what they're seeing and believing what they expect to see and believe. And the way to get out of that is by blinding. So when you do things like the blue zones, the first start is you have somebody doing the assessment of diets based on what they believe to be true. So they already know what they'd like to find. And then the question is, can you believe that they then assess the diets properly? You've got populations that are different in every imaginable way from the populations we're dealing with. So one of the arguments I make in the case for keto is that people who are, it's called metabolically disturbed, they have, there's whatever is wrong with their metabolism and physiology, they're getting fatter, their blood sugar is getting out of control. This is, it goes by the name metabolic syndrome in the medical community. So that's a cluster of disorders that associate with obesity and diabetes and heart disease, and they associate in populations. And these people are different from lean people, lean, healthy people. So like our great grandparents were lean, healthy people, wherever they were.
Yeah.
Because this disorder, this cluster of diseases didn't work. And then generation after generation, like the last time we talked, I was talking about sugar, and the hypothesis is you add sugar to any population, manifest obesity, diabetes, is metabolic syndrome, heart disease. And then when the women in that population get pregnant, they're going to pass it on to their kids. And their kids are going to have it a little bit worse than they do. So they're going to have a little bit earlier, and it's going to manifest itself a little bit more severely. And when those women get pregnant, they're going to pass it on to their kids. So each successive generation is worse than the one in the past. So if you want to take 2021 Americans and turn them into the equivalent of 2021, Sicilians or Sardinians. Sardinia is a blue zone. It may not be enough to just get us to eat what the Sardinians are eating, because we're 100 years down this trail of this generational trail of metabolic disease. So there's so many different issues that get conflated into these simplistic answers. I'm giving a simplistic answer. I acknowledge that. But
even how that data is collected, let's say you go to Sardinia, how do you know what the people are eating? Most of it is self-report data, right? You just ask people, what do you eat? And so...
Well, and with populations like... Go ahead.
No, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, with populations like that, I think it's easier to just ask them what they eat, because they do tend to eat the same things. If they're not going to McDonald's and they're not eating out of restaurants and they're not shopping at supermarkets, but traditional populations living in village communities, eating basically what they grow and what livestock they raise, it's easier to ask them what they eat, assuming that's all they eat. there's a interesting study that was raised as an argument against the sugar hypothesis, and it was a study of a island population off the coast of Central America, and they argued that they ate more sugar on the isolated island in which they lived than they did when they emigrated into the cities in the nearest Central American country. And I read this paper, and it was interesting, and I said, I'm like, how is that possible?
Yeah.
That they would have more access even to sugary beverages and sugary snacks on this isolated, this island. And so you don't always know whether you should believe what you read in these articles. But I don't know, Sardinia is an interesting example. When you read the history of the Sardinian diet, it was meat rich. It was cattle rich and, fish on the island. And then, like many Mediterranean populations during World War II, they are sort of the economy is devastated by the war, and they come out of it and they go through a lengthy period of famine. And by the way, that lengthy period of famine in population's history might make them live longer. The people who survive that might be more metabolically healthy than the people who don't. There's no way to tell. This is, again, one of the problems with those kind of comparisons. The one thing you do know about all those populations is that they don't eat a lot of sugar and white flour.
Right.
And so maybe any population will live to be something close to 100 or say 10 years longer than they do now if they don't eat sugar and white flour, which was always the sort of one of the bedrock arguments in the books I've been writing.
Yeah. Here I was just thinking of David Hume's definition of causality, constant conjunction. A happens, then B happens, A happens, then B happens. And then he refutes that by saying, well, the rooster crows and the sun rises. Clearly, it's not just constant conjunction. So then he introduces counterfactual causality. You take A out and see if B happens again. And so you silence the rooster, the sun comes up. Okay, it's not the rooster. So here, is an example. So you have a population and you take out the sugar and flour, and then you see what happens. If they still got obesity and diabetes and so on, then that would tell us something. But if they don't, that at least moves us in the direction of another hypothesis, strengthening.
And this is the argument. Again, there's a whole group of people out there who have dedicated their lives to proving what an idiot I am. I think it's kind of a waste of their time, but they don't. And one of the counter arguments is, if your hypothesis is sugar and white flour cause diabetes, obesity, etc., to manifest in any traditional diet, what is the counterfactual? So if you find a population that eats sugar and white flour, or in this case, honey, that was always the example, because it turns out that pastoral populations actually consume significant amount of honey. If they don't have obesity and diabetes while consuming significant amount of honey, does that mean that other sugary products, Coca-Cola and say, Cocoa Crisps, are not going to cause obesity and diabetes in those populations? And the answer is, it's evidence that they might be resistant to sugar. Is it evidence that every population is resistant to sugar? Well, no, because the other part of the hypothesis is that when you add sugar to a diet that was sugar-free, these people manifest all these disorders. So if they were eating honey for thousands of years, they may have had their obesity and diabetes epidemic several thousand years ago, and we're dealing with the
survivors,
evolutionary, the survivors, in effect.
Yeah, it's like the Sherpas in the Himalayas that have amazing VO2 uptake capacity and lung capacity, where they can live at 15,000 feet, whereas you and I would pass out or get massive headaches. And that appears to be generational, not just that they themselves grew up there, but multiple generations. So an epigenetic effect could be something like that.
Right.
Yeah, listening to your book again, I was thinking of the replication crisis in the social sciences and the medical sciences. I think that, I don't know, whatever you want to call them, the nutritional sciences or dietary sciences, I think, have the same problem of the systems are so complex. It's easy to say run 9 experiments or an experiment with 9 different conditions and find one that was significant, and you publish that. And then you get the file drawer effect where the other 8, just no one even knows that they ran those experiments. And this appears to happen particularly with complex systems like human behavior. And so you end up with these cutesy psych experiments. Like if you hold a cup of warm water and then you meet somebody, you're more likely to assess them as warm and engaging and nice, as opposed to holding a cold cup of water. Then you have a harsher appraisal of the person. Or if you're at the top of an escalator versus the bottom, you give more money to somebody that's asking for a donation. These things never replicate. They're because how much money somebody gives or how generous somebody is can't possibly be the effect of one variable, like how high up you are in an escalator, right? So I think nutritional science is at that level. I mean, there's just back to the bad calories, good calories, your much earlier book, and this not even wrong idea that people that are fat eat too many calories. And then but if since you go back to the 19th century, I think a lot of the social sciences and biological sciences tried to model themselves on that Newtonian mechanical clockwork universe where it's all machinery. And it does make intuitive sense in that model. Like, well, what is a calorie? It's heat. It's a thermodynamic model. So if you put too much in and you don't, put out as much energy, then you're going to have an imbalance there. Too much energy is stored in there, and that's fat, and then you become obese. It kind of makes sense in that simplistic model.
It did make sense, but the other thing to remember is it's the only thing they could measure back then that seemed relevant to mass. So they had the physicists talking about energy. Einstein was talking about energy. The laws of thermodynamics had been a great sort of advance in modern physics, and that comes out of this period from the late 19th century. And this is the thing, in 1866, that's the birth of modern nutrition. And the birth of modern nutrition is the creation of a device called a calorimeter that allows researchers to measure how much energy is expended by a large animal, in this case, either a dog or a human. And now if you could measure the energy in and the energy out, the laws of thermodynamics are true, then you could generate a hypothesis about obesity. So all the rest of nutrition is vitamin and mineral deficiency disorders, basically. A little bit about fiber, some understanding about the role of protein, but nothing that they could relate to obesity. So when researchers, and again, these are doctors, right? They're not trained to be scientists, although the German and Austrians tended to be better trained. They needed a theory of obesity. So they came up with a theory that it's an energy balance disorder. This is a German named von Noorden right around 1900. And the reason he had this theory is because that's all they could measure. Calorimetry was the fashion, like gut biome today or omics. That was the new technology. People had these small calorimeters they could hook up to patients lying in bed, and they could measure the carbon dioxide that they're breathing out, or the carbon monoxide, and the oxygen in, and they could calculate how much energy they were expending. And this was cool stuff. So that was their hypothesis. The science of hormones, actually the term endocrinology wasn't even coined until 1905 or so. And when insulin's discovered and growth hormones discovered in the early 1920s, these things are still called ductless glands and internal secretions. And the obesity community starts creating arguing. I mean, doctors start arguing that obesity cannot be a hormonal disorder when they have virtually no understanding of hormonal regulation and how it works and signaling and enzymes on cells, receptors, and all of that is sort of post-1960s science. And so by 1930, there's a University of Michigan clinician who's arguing dogmatically that he has proven experimentally that obesity is caused by eating too much. And the rest of the field buys into it without ever really understanding his experiments or the counter-arguments which are being made by German and Austrian researchers saying clearly it's a hormonal disorder. Look, men and women fatten differently. That tells you sex hormones are involved in fat accumulation, Uh, People get fat locally. There's certain places on your body you get fat and other places you don't. That tells you there are local factors that are determining fat accumulation, independent of how much people eat and exercise. And the German and Austrian school evaporates with the Second World War. The Americans arguing it's all about gluttony and sloth survived the war. And post-World War II, the U.S. has virtually a monopoly on funding of basic science. And this idea that obesity is caused by eating too much becomes a de facto, like I said, the bedrock assumption of modern obesity science. And if you go around and ask an obesity researcher, so think about it. If you ask a physicist the origin of Newton's laws or Einstein's relativity, I mean, you're basically insulting them, right? And you've told them the answer by asking them the question. Newton's laws, Einstein's theory of relativity, you've given them the answer. If you ask an obesity researcher the origin of this idea that obesity is an energy balance disorder, they won't know it. They'll be insulted. And they'll be a little angry. I've done this. I spent last winter for a magazine article asking them this question. And one of them gave me an honest answer who said, I should know that. I realize I should know that, but you make a good point. I don't. A couple of them got insulted, and a few of them just ignored the question.
Yeah, you make the point in your book, the importance of understanding the history of science, of your science that you're working in, so you know what mistakes have been made. One of my favorite Stephen Jay Gould stories is when he met Richard Feynman for the first time at Caltech. And he was going in to give a public talk, and Feynman had sent him a note saying, I'd like to meet and have lunch with you. I have some ideas I'd like to bounce off you. So Gould's like, okay, wow, the great Feynman, this will be fun, right? So Feynman spins this whole story about how he's worked out a new wrinkle on natural selection. Turns out it was just basically sexual selection. And Gould's like, this was worked out like a century ago, right? You don't have to reinvent this. If you knew a little bit of history, you don't have to do this. Right. So it is important to know what mistakes are made. Well, this is what you also have to know. Like Gould could have told you, on what basis have we decided that this is true, right? So and this is how physics is taught. That's the only subject I know because I studied physics in college. I wasn't very good at it, but it's taught historically because it gets more complex as it goes along. So it suits itself to that. But you're taught not just what to believe, but why you believe it. Right. What the theory was and what the experiment was and what the experiment found that can tell you. And in obesity, nutrition, and medicine in general, there's none of that. It's just right. So people believe things dogmatically without having any awareness, even that was at one point a hypothesis, and what evidence or what experimental test was used to confirm that hypothesis. This idea that we had fat because we eat too much is a hypothesis. And it wasn't until like 10 years ago when I co-founded a not-for-profit to try and raise money to do this and failed miserably, that anyone had ever actually tried to do a legitimate test of that hypothesis, that obesity is caused by excess consumption of calories. Yeah, those stories you tell about scientists actually postulating the reason postmenopausal women put on weight is because they're playing too much bridge and eating bonbons and not getting enough exercise and it's just would be hard to believe a scientist would actually even contemplate, just an anecdotal story like that. Well, again, you have to really recalibrate your sensibilities when you go back and read the literature on obesity, because it's incredibly sexist for starters. And the idea is you have to find an excuse for why fat people might eat too much. And again, one of the arguments I make in the book, so you could ask, and I got, so when my sugar book came out, I got a condescending review from Jerome Gropeman in the New Yorker, and I quote from it in this book. I don't say it was in a condescending review. And he said, that one of the bedrock facts in all of nutrition science is the importance of calories.
Calories in greater than calories out cause obesity. And I say, well, one of the interesting questions you might ask is you might want to quantify that, what you mean by that. Because if you quantify what you mean by that, then you could begin to understand what that statement itself means. So by how many calories do I have to overeat to get obese? And question was first asked, I first saw in the literature in 1924 in the seminal metabolism textbook written by a guy named Eugene Dubois, who was at then the Russell Sage Institute in New York, became Cornell Medical School, part of Cornell. And Sage said, look, we work it out, a pound of fat is equal to about 3,500 calories. So if you maintain a healthy weight your whole life, right, you have to be in perfect energy balance. That means your intake and your expenditure are always balanced perfectly. And if you're off by like 10 calories a day, which is about 0.05% inaccuracy, then you're going to accumulate 10 calories a day in your fat tissue, which is going to build up to a pound of fat a year and 10 pounds a decade, and 20 pounds over 20 decades.
Right.
So when we talk about the importance of calories, what we mean is that you have to balance your calories perfectly. Perfectly. Energy in has to perfectly equal energy out. And if you're off by 0.05%, you're going to get obese. 0.1, like the obesity epidemic.
Yeah.
Is something like 6 calories a day of fat stored over 30 years.
Which is the equivalent, I think you said, of like a teaspoon of almonds or just like 2 almonds or something.
No, it's like an almond.
Yeah.
Actually, that's like half an almond or half a gummy bear. So you...
yeah.
And de facto, that's what I mean by not even wrong.
Right.
Clearly, your body must, and this is what Dubois said, clearly there must be some other way to regulate body fat other than this energy intake expenditure thing, because the energy intake expenditure thing doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Okay. I can't imagine a system that would balance this out, especially when I have no idea how much I'm eating every day.
Right.
I mean, I might eat the same thing, to within 200 calories. I can imagine that kind of on average. But I've been in energy balance for 10 years, right? Why is my expenditure matching that perfectly?
Right.
And to think that your brain does that. So all modern obesity, actually, let me digress a second. Can I tell you how this influences the rest of obesity science? So in 1930, this University of Michigan professor, Louis Newberg, decides that obesity is caused by eating too much. He says he's experimentally proven that based on his experiments on what looks to be about 5 to 7 human subjects. And he writes several papers about this, about the etiology of obesity, at a period in time where people writing about the cause of obesity, there might have been a dozen researchers around the world, each of whom who were writing a paper every few years suggesting things that might cause obesity. So Newberg comes, he says he's experimentally proven it, and by 1938, when the first animal model of obesity is created, one of the guys studying this animal model reads Newberg and decides that obesity is caused by overeating, and if you lesion the ventromedial hypothalamus of a rat, you'll get a rat that gets crazy hungry and grows obese. Okay? So this guy at Yale named John Brobeck reads Newberg, says, hey, I lesion these rats get crazy hungry. He calls it hyperphagia, excessive hunger, and they get obese. And what I've discovered is hyperphagia. I've discovered this experimental hunger. And there's another group actually at the University of Chicago that says, well, wait, the rats get obese even when they don't eat a lot. We lesion the hypothalamus. We get rats that are appetite is no different than any other rat, but it also gets obese. So it can't be the hyperphagia. But the people in Chicago, a guy named Ranson, who was the leading neuroanatomist of the era, he dies of a heart attack 3 months after writing this paper in 1942 or 43. And his postdoc, who was a prime author, joins the Air Force. This is how science hangs on such crazy history. The co-author joins the Air Force. This guy Brobeck at Yale, who had also studied with Ransom in Chicago. Brobeck's a medical student at Yale. He's the only one who continues publishing in the field. And by the time the war ends, Brobeck writes a review article saying he has created experimental hyperphagia, that's extreme hunger, and this shows that eating too much makes the rats get fat. And that's the theory that carries through to the 60s. By the 60s, psychologists and psychiatrists are trying to explain why people eat too much, fat people eat too much, and come up with behavioral tricks to get them to stop. My favorite one being, this was early 1960s, a psychologist who was trying to convince the wives of men suffering from obesity to not have sex with them on days when they ate a lot of food.
Okay.
They thought that's...
So Skinnerian
it's
model.
a behavioral problem, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
by
so,
the 1970s,
so let's just back up one second.
Wait, let me
there.
just...
Okay, all right, go ahead.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, finish. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, by the 1970s, when researchers, so you basically have two models of obesity. One says it's caused by eating too much, more calories coming in than going out, and the other saying it's a fuel partitioning problem. It's how you use the fuel once you use it. So you could store it as fat, or you could burn it for fuel, and that's hormonally regulated. That's very carefully regulated by hormones and enzymes and receptors. So if you think of it as how you partition the fuel after you eat it, that's one hypothesis. Some of us partition to fat, and we get fatter, and some of us partition to energy, and we stay lean, and we just burn it, no matter how much we eat. And then the others is intake expenditure. So by the 1970s, researchers, psychologists think it's about eating too much because they're psychologists, and that's the behavioral issue. So they're looking for the signal that tells your brain to stop eating. Okay, there must be a signal from the gut to the brain, and there's some psychologists at Cornell Med School in New York discover something called cholecystokinin, CCK, which seems to be this signal. So they publish papers saying they've discovered the signal for hunger and satiety, and it's CCK. They're actually pretty good scientists. They don't really link it to obesity, and then a guy at Rockefeller, and Jeff Friedman, decides he's going to solve obesity, and Jeff's a very good scientist. And Jeff has studied the CCK work, so he thinks he's looking for the signal from the fat cells to the brain that tell the brain to stop eating when the fat cells fill up with fuel. So again, he's not actually trying to explain obesity, he's trying to explain eating behavior.
Right.
Why do fat people eat too much? The assumption is always they get fat because they eat too much. So Jeff, through very meticulous, rigorous work, discovers the hormone leptin, the most famous discovery in obesity science. And he assumes it's the signal from fat cell to brain, because that's what he set out to look for. Okay, he doesn't assume it's a signal that determines fuel partitioning in the periphery, in the body, because he doesn't even know that hypothesis ever existed, because that hypothesis has been gone since the 1950s. So everything that we've interpreted about leptin and other hormones like it ever since then were all determined by the assumptions that the very first scientist had when he did the research, which was determined by the assumptions some other good researchers had 80 years earlier, which was determined by decisions made in World War II based on who lived and who died during the war. I mean, it's a crazy story.
It is a crazy story.
And nobody knows it because these people don't study, they don't bother studying the history.
I can't remember if this was
They don't even know that there is a history.
I can't remember if this is in your current book or a previous book, but wasn't there something about Eisenhower's heart attack being affiliated with him eating too much meat, and therefore meat must be bad and animal fat is bad, and no one brought up the fact that he smoked cigarettes?
The very first book on, the good calories, bad calories, I started the book with the story of Eisenhower's heart attack, but I used it for different.
Okay.
And Eisenhower's heart attack, which was, I think, by 1956, because he was president when he had it, right? He had a physician who kept meticulous notes. And so there's a book called Eisenhower's Heart Attack that was written by a University of Texas historian based on the notes that the physician kept. And the interesting thing about it is he had high cholesterol, right? So there's a theory brewing that cholesterol causes heart disease. And Eisenhower kind of has high cholesterol. So after the heart attack, his doctor puts him on a cholesterol-lowering diet. It was called the prudent diet at the time. And basically has him avoiding all fat and all cholesterol. So he's eating like rye crisps for breakfast and I mean, just a horribly boring food. And the guy's driving Eisenhower crazy because Eisenhower's also hungry all the time. Yeah. And Eisenhower's getting in a worse mood. And the doctor is recording his cholesterol numbers and his mood and his physical fitness. And Eisenhower is getting fatter. When he used to be able to maintain his weight effortlessly, now he's suddenly gaining weight and his cholesterol is going up. And the doctor gets to the point where he's lying to Eisenhower about his latest blood test because Eisenhower now has such an crazy temper because he's starving himself all day long.
Right.
That the doctor's afraid to tell him the truth, that all of this is just making his cholesterol go higher, not lower, which is what the theory is. And of course, this has zero effect on the hypothesis that we get fat because of the cholesterol in our diets and the dietary fat. And then so we've all been told to eat like Eisenhower was told in 1956.
Right.
It's crazy, Michael.
It is
I feel
crazy.
like,
Yeah, but and then also the role of religion. You don't really discuss this too much in the book, but I got to thinking about that. Because the moment you shift it from a medical or a biochemical issue to a psychological issue, then you can enter in that kind of the fact that gluttony is one of the 7 deadly sins. There's something wrong with their willpower. They're weak. And now you have a moral component. And so if you're not obese, you can say, well, the problem is they're weak-willed and they just can't control themselves.
Yeah, well, and this is the argument I do make in the book, which is that this is the root of all fat shaming. As soon as they decided obesity was an energy balance disorder, that's taking in more calories than you expend. So that's how much you eat and your control over your expenditures through physical activity. So it's eating behavior versus, sedentary behavior, which are both behaviors. So on one level, that's the problem. You're always dealing with assuming that the problem is caused by behavior. But it's worse than that because if you work out those numbers I talked about, if you've gained 50 pounds between high school and age 50 and your best friend has remained lean, that 50 pounds represents 50 excess calories a day. Excuse me.
No, it was less than. I think it was 10 calories a day.
Yeah, it's about 25 calories a day extra. So it's 3 almonds that your fat tissue is storing that his fat tissue isn't. So now you have to have a hypothesis that explains why you wouldn't compensate. Okay, considering how tiny this number is, why wouldn't you compensate? All you have to do is eat like a mouthful of food. Take 1 bite of food less, dude.
Yeah, right.
And so your choices are you're either lack the willpower. I mean, these are the only choices I could see, or you don't realize that you should eat a bite of food less. So it's lack of willpower, ignorance, or maybe and this is what we spend an enormous amount of time and money trying to study. Maybe the food environment makes it so difficult for you, just so impossible to take that bite of food less, that we can blame it on the food system. And a lot of modern obesity research is about the implications that this is all about a behavior, but can we find a way to give people a pass? There is even genetic research where people will argue that the genes that determine obesity basically work in the brain and make it impossible for some people to take that single bite of food less.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine any other genetic phenomena, that affects behavior that wouldn't allow for a conscious control of that small extent. So you end up basically shaming everyone who's obese into thinking, because clearly, if it was you, you'd be able to take the bite less, right? Thin people know they could do it because they must be doing it. They're still thin.
Right. Yeah. So, and I love that bit about the tautology. why are people obese? Because they eat too much. Well, why do they eat too much? Well, because they're obese. It doesn't explain anything.
Well, so the idea is obesity, right, is caused by positive energy balance. That's back to the Newton's laws of obesity science. The Newton law of obesity is caused by positive energy balance. And they know this. We know this because there's something called the energy balance equation, which is the first law of thermodynamics and simplistic equation 4. So it's change in energy in a system is equal to the energy that goes into the system minus the energy that goes out of the system. It's like saying the change in the number of people in a room is equal to the number of people that go into the room minus the number of people that go out of the room.
Right.
Or conserve. It's like the simplest possible math. And from that, we get this hypothesis that obesity is caused by positive energy balance. And when I discuss this with people, and I've gotten a bad habit of doing this on Twitter because I feel unloved at the moment.
You do?
So trying to publish a book in the
Gary, don't read Twitter comments. I would kill myself if I read all my comments. They're always bad.
No, it's definitely,
everybody's hated on social media.
Yeah, it's bad. But anyway, the point is, you say to people, well, getting fatter isn't caused by positive energy balance. Getting fatter is positive energy balance, right? That's why there's an equal sign. There's not an arrow of causality. It doesn't say delta E is caused by E in minus E out. It says delta E equals E in minus E out. We do believe in physics, and the laws of physics tell us mass is equivalent to energy, give or take the speed of light squared. So, if you're saying there's an equal, it's saying the same thing in two different ways.
Yeah.
That's what the equal sign means. This equals that, not this is caused by that. This equals that.
Right.
And I argued this with the Washington Post columnist. And it was funny. She said, next thing you know, Taubes is going to argue that people don't get rich because they make more money than they spend.
Right.
And I went, yeah, you're right. Taubes does argue exactly that. Of course, if getting rich means they make more money than they spend, actually means they make a lot more money than they spend. That's But that doesn't tell you anything about the cause. Again, this is where you get to not even wrong. And you'd be hard pressed to find you won't find a textbook that doesn't say obesity is caused by positive energy balance. It's hard to even find an article in the literature. But the way it perverts the research today, like I said, is obesity research. People aren't actually studying fat accumulation in fat cells, which is the problem. So you could say obesity is a disorder of excess fat accumulation. That fat is stored in cells called adipocytes. Occasionally it leaks out of the adipocytes and then it accumulates elsewhere, like around your organs. And that's a part of So what you want to know is what regulates the storage of fat in the fat cells and what locks the fat in there, and then what hormones, what signals are necessary to get fat out of the fat cells. So you're studying processes called lipogenesis and lipolysis and lipid oxidation and fatty acid metabolism. Basically, there's the natural history of fat in your body. So where it starts, where it goes, why it stays there, why it's released when it's released, why it's burned for fuel, what happens to the fat that isn't burned for fuel. All of this was studied in the 1960s. Yeah. It's considered irrelevant to the science of obesity because the people studying obesity are trying to figure out why fat people eat so much. And I apologize for the terminology. I used very blunt wording to make the point that whether they know it or not, that's how they think about it.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. It's politically a more sensitive way to say it is people with obesity. But if they really cared about people with obesity, they wouldn't be trying to figure out why they eat so much because they have no idea how much they eat. They would be trying to figure out why those people are storing excess fat in their fat cells. Right. Yeah. Entirely different question, entirely different science.
Steve Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, he has sort of the history of the research on human violence. And for a long time, the scientific explanation was kind of a hydraulic or thermodynamic model in which anger builds up and it has to be released in the form of violence. And that even nations, the reason nations go to war is they have this kind of build up where they have to just kind of release all that violence and go and invade somebody. I mean, just barbaric, and then you get the redundancy. Well, then why did violence go down? Well, because people became less violent. It's like that's not an explanation. The question is, why did they become less violent? Well, because violence decreased. It's like, no, that's not an answer. So you have to go in search of an exogenous cause. What would cause that outside of the system? So I think that's kind of what you're talking about here. So, by the way, on the fat cells sending the signal to the brain to stop eating, how could that possibly work? Because if you eat a bucket of ice cream, it's going to be a day or two before it's packed onto in your cells. I mean, we're talking about signals that happen within a few minutes.
Yeah, well, this is not the kind. Again, I hate to say this, but they don't ask those kinds of questions. I've kind of written myself into a corner in the journalism world, because once I had an opinion that these people were doing terrible science, magazines tend not to let me ask them those kinds of questions. So it's very confusing. But yeah, I've always thought the same way about leptin in particular. So that's supposed to be the signal. So we do store fat pretty quickly as we consume it. So the fat we eat does get stored pretty quickly. But
how quickly? Not
on the level of the meal itself, because we have to absorb and digest and absorb it first. So a signal to the brain suggesting that somehow there is fat stored and we should dial down our intake doesn't seem to take into account any of the short-term behavioral issues. If you've had, I often wonder, do these people have kids? Right?
Probably not.
Yeah, I mean, do they feed their kids? Are they so busy in their laboratory that they don't feed their kids or their pets, for that fact?
Same thing with dogs.
My kids, when they were young, I used to want to do an experiment that, I could take them to breakfast and feed them something for breakfast, and they would eat it, and we'd be done and go home. But if I added French fries to whatever they ate, so there's another theory floating around that basically this is originally the work of a couple of Australians who have what they call the protein leverage hypothesis, and the idea is that we evolved to eat until we've satisfied our protein needs. And through some magical way, our body knows when we've satisfied our protein needs. And then if we're eating low protein foods, right, we'll have to consume more calories, which I can imagine on some level evolutionarily that was true. If you weren't getting enough protein in the diet, you might keep eating carbohydrates and fat until you eventually did. And so you would have to figure out what to do with the carbohydrates and fat. So you have two choices: store them or burn them. So we might have evolved a system that works, but on the short term, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine I take my child and I give him a hamburger, a McDonald's hamburger for lunch. And the kid's going to eat the McDonald's hamburger, and then he's going to go away. Go up and play Fortnite, like that's what they do. Yeah. However, if I give him the McDonald's hamburger, same amount of protein and 500 calories of French fries.
Yes, right.
He's going to eat the identical protein, but now he's going to eat the 500 calories of French fries. How does the protein content, we've controlled for protein intake, right? And those two meals, we haven't controlled for calories. What can the protein possibly have to do with it?
Right.
I mean, I could double his protein. I could add to the experiment, the thought experiment.
I think about that when I look at those calorie menus where they have the calorie. I could have 2 hamburgers and skip the fries, or maybe even take the buns off and just eat the meat. And I'm getting far more for my money and for my calories and avoiding the fat, for the same price.
Well, this is, I mean, it was, I pointed this out, I think it was the reason, so getting back to ketogenic diets, that's what ultimately the book is. So the book is ultimately arguing We don't get fat because we eat too much. We get fat because our bodies are
Yeah.
trying to store calories as fat, and that's a hormonal regulatory issue, and the primary hormone is insulin. And we secrete insulin primarily in response to the carbohydrates we eat.
Yep.
So carbohydrates are fattening. That's the simplest way to,
It seems.
the hypothesis is calorie per calorie,
Yep.
carbs are fattening.
Right.
Dietary fat, oddly enough, is not. And if you minimize if you want to minimize insulin, and there's arguments to be made that many people who suffer with obesity have to minimize their insulin to mobilize the fat that they've accumulated, then you're basically abstaining from all carb-rich foods. You're eating green leafy vegetables and fatty animal products. And if you do that, you will mobilize fat and store it. So that's when you get to keto and the ketogenic diet. If you're maximally avoiding carbs, you're eating an effective keto diet and replacing those calories with fat.
Yeah.
The argument is some of us if some of us want to be lean after this century of generational effects by which we created a species, a phenotype of massive, of significant to massive obesity.
Endomorphs.
The only way to reverse endomorphs, yeah. The only way to reverse it is to minimize. I love the line. What was his name? The ectomorph, endomorph guy. Shelton.
I think so. Yeah. I forget. Yeah.
Yeah. At Harvard. And he said, when you starve an ectomorph, you don't get, effectively, you starve a obese person, you don't get a lean person, you get an emaciated obese person.
Right. Who's in a bad mood most of the time.
Yeah, if you starve a basset hound, you don't get a greyhound, you get an emaciated, angry basset hound. We are different. That's the argument. So the case for keto is those of us who fatten easily, and we know who we are different from the lean people who have been giving us advice, the Michael Pollans of the world, who are, don't fatten easily.
Right.
And if we eat what they eat, so the idea is we should eat what they eat, the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, you pick it, and then just eat fewer calories because we get fat because we eat too much. If we do that, we'll probably still be obese or fat, and we'll be hungry all the time.
Right.
And so we have to eat differently. And what we have to do is target this insulin thing. That's the argument. It's unfortunate in the sense that, there are carb-rich foods that are terrific. Like, it bothers me going through life not getting to eat donuts or choosing not to eat donuts, which is what I choose to do. But it also bothers me that I choose not to smoke cigarettes, and I used to be a smoker, so I'm not sure there's much difference there.
You were?
Yeah, you weren't?
No, I missed that. I'm afraid. Yeah. Well, so let's
it helps to have had an addiction.
Yes, I suppose. I'm kind of a mesomorph. It pretty much doesn't matter how much I starve myself or how much I work out or not or what I eat. I'm always pretty much the same weight. It varies by like 5% or something. It's not much. And this all resonates with me because obviously I know people that eat way more than me and they're skinnier, people that eat less and they're fatter than I am. And so it seems intuitively obvious. The science you present in the book is pretty solid. So let's go through what. Okay, let me back up. The dependent variable here is weight loss, and the concern you have is the obesity problem. So your book is not for somebody who's right at the perfect weight and everything's great and they want to eat for whatever, longevity or health, and they don't care about losing weight. Your book is more, the keto thing is more for losing weight. Or is it more than that?
Well, the keto thing is, again, and we're wrapping up a lot of science by calling a lot of sort of range of dietary approach. So we have two very related problems, obesity and then all the chronic diseases that associate with obesity.
Yeah.
And you could say metabolic syndrome, which is an insulin resistance syndrome, and all the chronic diseases that associate with insulin resistance, which includes heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, dementia. There's a whole slew of them. They used to be known as Western diseases because in populations that ate their traditional diets, you don't see these diseases.
Right.
So the argument is, at the moment, I'm writing this book to people who, have trouble controlling their weight, controlling their blood sugar, controlling their blood pressure. These three are all very closely related. They're all part of metabolic syndrome, this disorder. And metabolic syndrome is a disorder of carbohydrate consumption. It's related to the processing and the sugar content of the carbohydrates we eat. And that science is pretty clear.
Yeah.
But it's been kind of kept in the corner for 50 years because in the US, researchers bought into this idea that heart disease is caused by dietary fat.
Right.
And it's the fat content of the diet that's all the problem. So we should eat carb-rich diets to limit the fat content and we'll live longer. And this is a story that I tell in Good Calories, Bad Calories.
Right.
A variation of this story will be told in my next book, which is about diabetes. It's all in diabetes, which is a disorder of carbohydrate intolerance, right? You either lack insulin or you're insulin resistant, so you have trouble metabolizing the carbohydrates in your diet. That's a sort of primary defect. And since the 1970s, people with diabetes have been advised to eat even more carbohydrates than healthy people. And part of the reason is because the assumption is people with diabetes have high rates of heart disease. If they have high rates of heart disease, they should eat less saturated fat. So they should cut back on their fat consumption. You replace those calories with carbs.
Right.
So you tell them to do the exact thing that they're uniquely physiologically unsuited to do.
Right. Right.
And then they manifest terrible diabetic complications. And you say, well, they get high blood pressure because of the salt in their diet. And they go blind because we don't know why they go blind. And they have kidney failure. Maybe that's a protein they're eating. And they have atherosclerosis. Maybe they're still eating too much fat. I mean, the problem is, again, I can make very compelling arguments to you that everything I'm saying is true. And I can make them in my books.
Yeah, you
do. And again, one of the reasons I wrote the case for keto is to show that these arguments are getting across to people.
Oh, so I think, Gary, you've come, I've been following you I've known you since the 90s. I mean, you've come out on top on this debate. You were a fringe journalist, that everyone tried to push aside or ignore, but that's not the case anymore. I mean, as you point out in the book, you go online and just say keto near me, and you'll get restaurants and diets and doctors and supermarkets that sell the stuff and energy bars. You've this is now more mainstream.
It is more mainstream, but by mainstream, so again, my estimate is there are now a few tens of thousands of physicians around the world who, if you go to see them and you're overweight or you're bad, you're pre-diabetic or diabetic or you've got hypertension, they will say, look, stop eating carbs. Okay?
Right.
These carb-rich foods, breads, grains,
pasta,
starches, sugars, they're killing you.
Yeah.
And if you want to be healthy, you can't eat them. It's a shame that your best friend can, but he's not here with, hypertension or he's
right.
It's not about the salt you're eating. It's not about the saturated fat. If they believe if they can get their patients off carbs, they can make this happen. And that the success stories they have are remarkable. Now, there might be equal success stories in the vegan physician community.
Well,
I don't know.
I was going to ask you about that because, I read these books. I see these documentaries like Forks Over Knives. If you just eat nothing but plants, plant-based diet, you can reverse diabetes, you can reverse high blood pressure, you can reverse your cardiovascular disease. They have those MRIs or the CAT scans of veins or arteries that are clogged, and now they're not clogged after eating nothing but plant-based foods. And, they have a compelling story too.
Yeah, no, I know. And it's interesting, isn't it? So I try to suggest that, well, it's interesting. So the vegan vegetarian community will talk about the healthy let's just say vegetarian for now. We won't. A healthy vegetarian and not healthy vegetarian diets.
Okay.
So a healthy vegetarian diet is a diet that's plant-based that restricts sugars and ultra-processed grains, right? So anyone is going to get healthier. That was the original argument in Good Calories, Bad Calories, and my other work is that it's not about the dietary fat. It's about the processing of the carbohydrates, particularly grains and sugars. And if people restrict those, if you don't have 4 Cokes a day, you'll be healthier than if you do.
Yeah.
And if you don't eat, Wonder Bread for lunch, you'll be healthier than if you do. And that's the key. So that's going to happen on any diet. That's the hypothesis. Then the question is, are there people out there who are healthier because they're eating fewer animal products or giving up animal products entirely?
Yeah.
Compared to how they would be if they were eating an animal product rich diet that was also restricted in carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So in these, sugar and processed grains, and there might be, but the problem is you kind of need a clinical trial to tell you that that's the case. And the clinical trials that have been done are not very well designed. They're not designed to answer those questions. There's, again, that's just sort of the nature of the nutrition field. And the nutrition field is very strongly biased towards this idea that plant-based diets are healthier. That's what they've been arguing for 50 years. That's what these people grew up believing. Many of the researchers in the field went into the field to, as they saw it, to sort of demonstrate to people through their research that plant-based diets are healthier. So you have blinding issues again. I don't know. One of the ways I handle this in the book, that's one of my favorite chapters, even though it's not about science, it's about practical application, is where I talk about this physician, Carrie Dulish. She's a spine surgeon in Ohio. So I interviewed over 120 physicians for this book who had all sort of converted to this way of thinking. And Carrie comes from a family history of obesity, and she would have been, by her estimate, around 300 pounds, but she moved towards low-carb ketogenic eating, but she also doesn't tolerate animal food. Oh, by the way, she was also diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. So she's a metabolic mess, and she's managed to stay healthy and stay functioning as a spine surgeon, eating a ketogenic vegan diet. And she says the reason she avoids animal, it can be done. Their Facebook's dedicated. And she says the reason she does it is not because of any religious or ethical beliefs, but because she doesn't feel good when she eats animal products. She says, and this is my favorite quote, "It's not a religion, it's just about how I feel."
Right.
And I contrast her with a psychologist in Western Massachusetts named Georgia Ede, who made a similar transition, also comes from a family history of obesity, and eats a carnivore diet. So eats 0 plant products now.
Okay.
And she does that because she doesn't believe her body can tolerate plants.
Yeah.
And on some level, you've got to believe them. I know there's a lot of people say, it's very easy to disbelieve anyone who has a belief system that's different than yours. But that's sort of the point. Many of these physicians I interviewed, probably most of them, had gone through periods where they had been vegetarian or even vegan, trying to improve their health. They were all very health conscious. They were all getting heavier or getting diabetic or some health problem.
Yeah.
And when the conventional wisdom doesn't work, you try fad diet. So in this day and age, the first thing you're likely to try is a vegetarian or a vegan diet. And if they get better, those people never talk to me. That's a selection bias in my reporting. So for every 10 physicians who
what we
have
want to know is
pre-diabetes.
What we want to know is not anecdotes or that person did this or that person did that population-wise. I mean, you take 100,000 people and, X percent did vegan and X percent did keto and X percent did paleo or whatever. And then what was the outcome on average? Because you can always find somebody that smokes and drinks and lives to be 100 like George Burns, and somebody else that, that runs 3 hours a day and eats the perfect diet and keels over dead at 35. So the individuals, for a doctor, the person standing there in front of you says, I feel like crap. You want to help that person. But we're talking about something different there.
Well, but that's the thing. You start with, the conventional wisdom, right, is diets don't help. because all these people, we have an obesity epidemic. There's more obese people in the nation now. There's a greater percentage of obese people in the nation than there was 20 years ago or 40 years ago. So the assumption is...
And what is it now? Like 40% of Americans are technically
like
obese?
40%, depending. I mean, different ways of assessing it come up with different numbers, but it's a huge number. So, but the argument I'm making, we're so programmed to think we need huge clinical trials and huge observational studies to determine what truth is in science. But the observational studies, as we discussed with the blue zones, you only get associations.
Yes.
So you might find out what, of the people, if we have 100,000 people and 2,000 did keto and 4,000 did paleo and 5,000 did vegetarian, we might find out what their relative health status is, but we won't know whether their diets were causal because this was not an intervention trial. It was not an experiment. It was just an observation. The people who did keto may have been the most obese to start with. So they may have started at 800 pounds, gotten down to 400 pounds, and you look and you say, look, all the people doing keto are at 400 pounds. I'm not going to advise anyone to do that.
Right.
But, and you're right, they might have more willpower. Maybe it takes more willpower to do keto or vegetarian, or maybe if you're you just don't know. You need a clinical trial.
Yeah, that's the problem.
But the argument here...
also, once you go on a diet like that, it's the going on part and the behavioral commitment to keep up with it. And then while you're doing that, maybe you stop smoking, maybe you increase your exercise, maybe you do other things that are also healthy, and that doesn't get reported or whatever.
One of the arguments in favor of vegetarian, mostly plant diets, not just the 7-day Adventists, I think, are considered a blue zone.
Yeah.
And these are people who consider their bodies to be holy, and they have a religion that's basically about healthy living. Part of their healthy living tends to be being a vegetarian. But you have another religion like Mormon where they tend to be meat eaters. And at least when these studies were done, the Mormons lived as long as the Seventh-day Adventists.
Right.
But then they stopped doing those studies because I guess the Seventh-day Adventist nutritionists studied the Seventh-day Adventist population. Mm-hmm. And the fact that what they were eating correlated with longevity, and what they were eating was determined in part by their religion, resonated well. And so we have an argument that we should all eat like Seventh-day Adventists.
Right.
We don't get that. All right. So anyway, it's
yep.
The point is, for each doctor and each patient, again, if you fatten easily, and maybe since you don't, Michael, you don't understand this logic, but it's an inexorable problem. You basically I spent my adult life on a diet. Now, I look very healthy. In fact, and I look
Gary,
like an athlete.
I was going to say something. You look leaner now than I ever remember you being. Is that because you shifted more toward keto, or is it the lighting?
Could be the camera. Yeah, it's a combination of things that I've experimented with over the years. I tried intermittent fasting as an experiment. I think I mentioned this in the book. So in effect, it's a fancy word for saying I stopped eating breakfast or snacks after dinner. And I was just curious because it was becoming a fad. And the idea is these are easy things to test. So my weight had been around, I'm 6'2". I was a football player in college. I had been around 220, 225 for 10 years. I tried intermittent fasting. I stopped eating breakfast. After 3 days, I wasn't hungry in the morning anymore. And I liked the fact that I seemed to be alert. And my weight dropped over the course of 3 months down to around 212, which was my boxing weight. When I was 25 years old.
Yeah.
I wasn't hungry. It wasn't an issue. It's just my weight came down, which was nice. I kept it up, not because I lost weight, but because I feel my brain works better in the mornings. I'm sharper when I don't eat.
Yeah.
So I like the way, again, and this is the kind of thing. It wasn't a religion. I felt better.
Right. That's a good.
The point is,
that's a good dependent variable. Like, how do you feel? That matters. And
the other thing is, if you've spent your whole life getting fatter, okay, or being overweight and obese. And all of us, at least in the world I live in, who do this, go on and off different diets. I mean, when I worked at Discover Magazine in the 80s in Manhattan and Rockefeller Center, I used to go on sushi diets for 3 weeks. I'd lose 10 pounds and I'd want to blow my brains out at the end of 3 weeks. I mean, I love sushi, but
yeah,
there was some neurological phenomenon going on as well.
With the mercury.
Yeah, you try mostly plant diets, you try vegetarian, you try vegan, and eventually you get to this keto thing, which used to be called Atkins.
Yeah.
And for some significant percentage of the population, it just changes the way your body works.
Yeah.
It's not that you eat less. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But suddenly a significant portion of the excess fat you're carrying goes away.
Yeah.
It's like a switch has been flipped. If you're not carrying excess weight, you can't do that experiment for yourself. You can't have that experience. Like, you're unlucky because you're stable weight and you're happy with your weight. I could do the experiment.
I wouldn't mind losing 10 more pounds. And I know if I didn't work out a lot and be at least moderately careful on what I eat, I would definitely be overweight. When I was in graduate school, after I stopped bike racing in the late 80s there and early 90s, I put on like 15 pounds in a year. And I thought, holy crap, I better watch this or I'm going to blow up here. And, because I've seen some of my, old cycling buddies and they blow up because they stop riding and they just change their whole lifestyle. So, personally, but then the intermittent fasting, since you mentioned that, I've tried that. It works. I love it. And if you eat dinner at around 6 or 7, and then if you have something to do in the morning, so I work out, I ride every morning for a couple hours. If I don't ride, it's hard to make it till, say, 11 or 12 o'clock without eating. If I ride, then I'm working out. I don't want to eat when I'm working out. And then I get home and shower and change and whatever, read the paper, and then I can make it till 11 or 12. So what's the latest recommended on intermittent fasting? Maybe 14, 16 hours without eating?
I mean, again, it depends what you can do. But let me ask you, you said it worked. So define worked.
Work was losing about 10 pounds that, was just extra weight I didn't need.
Yeah. I
mean, if you looked at me, you wouldn't go, well, you look fat. But, like on a bike, when I'm climbing a hill with the guys, if I'm 10 pounds over, I can tell. I can just feel the difference. I feel more energetic without that extra weight. So that's what I mean by work. I feel better. I lose a little weight. Not obvious, but I feel it.
And that's what, that's the thing. You need clinical trials to tell you whether you're going to live longer, what the effect is going to be on longevity, the factor that you can't see in the present. You need clinical trials to tell you whether diet A is more likely to work than diet B.
Right.
But you don't need a clinical trial to tell you whether this works for you.
Right.
And when I think of what I've accomplished as a journalist and Nina Teicholz along with me and others, is we've managed to convince people that these diets won't kill them.
Right.
So when I first wrote about this for the New York Times Magazine in 2002, the assumption was I was waiting to die.
Right.
I had done the Atkins as an experiment. I was sitting at breakfast eating my scrambled eggs and bacon and waiting for the heart attack. I'm still kind of waiting for the heart attack. But
yes, I know what you mean.
There have been a few hundred clinical trials that show that this way of eating is benign and beneficial even. And there's about 100 clinical trials in the works testing it on a whole variety of chronic disorders.
Yeah.
So you can do it. Best if you have a physician's help. But the reason people like me write books is for those, want to do it. You can try it.
So that's your message. Give it a try and see how you feel.
Yeah, basically, see what happens. I'm going to assume that if somebody switches, abstains more or less rigid abstinence from carbohydrates, that's a phrase I use, replaces it with fat. So instead of having, the skinless chicken breast with broccoli and a mashed potato for dinner, you have chicken thighs with the skin.
I like the skin.
Some kind of butter sauce. And everyone does. That's what the taste is.
Yeah.
And you have like broccoli and you put some butter and olive oil on the broccoli and you skip the potatoes. You can have the same amount of calories. It's not about the calories. If you eat that way and you gain weight, then stop doing it. Okay,
Right.
then we
Right.
were wrong for you. I don't think that'll happen. I'm pretty confident I won't. But if it does, if you gain 20 pounds,
Yeah.
don't do it.
Yeah.
But you can do this yourself. You can do this at home. Again, it helps if you have a doctor to work with who understands it. And part of the reason I wrote this book is so physicians will make the effort to understand the science, because it's important, and they can do wonderful things with their patients. They can actually make, this is the story I got from the doctors, right? You go into med school because you want to make people healthy.
Yeah.
Right? And then you find out 20 years later, your waiting room is full of people suffering from the negative sequelae of obesity and diabetes and hypertension. And all you're doing is managing their diseases. You're writing prescriptions.
Yeah. No good.
Okay. Then you get them off carbs and makes them healthy.
Yeah.
I mean, you literally see them get, these doctors talked about what they couldn't unsee. They couldn't unsee what happened to themselves and happened to their patients. And it sounds trite. They made medicine fun for them again, because now they can make people healthy. It wasn't just about writing a new prescription or figuring out what new drug to give them that'll keep their cholesterol down but won't give them a side effect.
Right. No, for me,
that's a rush if you're a doctor.
For me, the question and why I love reading your books, and I had Nina Teicholz on the podcast. I loved her book too. But I watch all those documentaries, read the vegan books, just in case, because again, for me, it's not I need to lose weight next week or else, it's going to be disastrous. But that, I have heart disease in my family. My father keeled over dead at 61. His father, around 60, died, heart attack. One of his two brothers died of a heart attack. And, so I'm
Were they overweight?
Not really, no. But my father was a lifelong alcoholic. So I suspect that his whole system was pretty fucked up just from drinking so much. And alcohol, of course, puts fat on, and that, he wasn't obese, but I'm sure he wasn't as lean as he could have been. But so my concern is not, what's going to happen next year. At 66, I feel like I have 5 years borrowed time here ahead of my dad. And I just want to keep going. And so I figure, just keep working out, keep riding my bike. But what should I eat? Okay, so I bounce around. I'll try this, I'll try that, and see how I feel. Some meat seems good. Like, for example, last Sunday, my buddy Mike and I did a 60-mile bike ride. And then, so we didn't eat anything. And then afterwards, we parked next to this barbecue truck, and we each had a half a slab of ribs. Yeah. No potato, no sides, just the ribs. And so at like 1 to 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon, I eat this half a slab of ribs. And I'm not hungry until like noon the next day. I mean, I can almost go 24 hours because the meat just contains so much, I guess, energy or whatever in that formula that I don't need to eat it. But on the other hand, I don't think eating a half a slab of ribs every day would be healthy either.
Well, that's just programming. That's how you program. That's how I was programmed. A lot of this, when I talk to these doctors about, how the challenges they had getting their patients to buy in, the biggest challenge was always getting them to accept that dietary fat and meat wasn't going to kill them, because this is how they've been programmed. Then it's easier. Again, you don't have to eat a low carb, high fat, or ketogenic diet. It can be plant-based. It can be all plants, but it's just easier to do. With animal products, because you're saying don't eat carbs, get your calories from protein and a lot of fat, and animals tend to be protein and fat without carbs. So you eat them, you're in the right macronutrient profile. Right. You don't have to play games to try and up the protein and get enough the right amino acids and get enough fat. And anyway, it's all programming. I don't know, and I'm lucky. I don't, knock on wood, I don't come from a family history of heart disease. My men on my father's family live until their 90s, and the people in my mother's family tend to go crazy young. So we'll see whose genes I got.
Yes.
Again, for somebody like you, you've got these competing paradigms. This is where you're really sitting in the middle of it, because, what we've been taught is it's all about dietary fat and saturated fat. So you should be eating a low-fat, mostly plant diet, maybe a Mediterranean diet where you're getting your fats from, olive oil and avocado. And,
right.
And the alternative is this metabolic syndrome story. and which is a carbohydrate story. So, I would say you maximize your health by, and I'm not a doctor, I'm a journalist, don't eat refined grains and sugars.
Yeah, yeah.
And go easy on the starches.
Right, right.
Again, as a endurance runner, well, there's a great book called The Art and Science of Low Carb Performance by Jeff Volek, who's an exercise physiologist at Ohio State, and Steve Finney, who did some of the first experiments ever on ketogenic diets using professional bike racers. And the argument is that you could probably even improve your bike racing by fat adapting and going ketogenic. But for somebody with your history of heart disease, you have to convince yourself it's not going to kill you, and that's hard to do. And like I said, I don't even have a family history, and I still struggle with it.
I had that scan of your heart and arteries for calcium, the calcium score. And, it's supposed to be below 500. Mine, it's supposed to be like around 100. Mine was 105 or something like that. So I figure, well, I'm okay. But it turns out that may be a proxy for something else, that even if it's high, it may not mean that you're about to keel over dead. Because one of my cycling buddies had a super high one, and he's just majorly fit. And so as I read it, it's like if you have an enlarged heart and the doctor goes, well, you got an enlarged heart. But then you go, well, I work out 4 hours a day. Oh, that's why you have an enlarged heart. It's not because you have a diseased heart. So, these measures may be proxies for something else. But I want to ask you about cholesterol. All you're reading. So if you have a slightly high elevated cholesterol, do you think the taking a statin is still the recommended correct thing, or do you think we're going to come around on that and that's going to turn out to be not that important?
I don't think we're ever going to come around because there's so much money in statins that, and the medical community believes in their, effectiveness so strongly that we're never going to get off the statin. Sorry, I don't know what to think. Yeah. I have friends who argue that they do far more harm than good, and I respect these people. I think they're bright, but I don't know if they're right about this because I haven't looked at the research myself, and there's so much research.
Yes.
I don't think I could do it. I think I'm already too biased against conventional medicine. I would say this. So back in the 70s, before the statins, came on the scene, when the clinical research community looked at cholesterol fractions for the first time to assess risk of heart disease, and they did it so beginning in the late 1960s, a tool was available that allowed these observational surveys to, you could take blood and then you could fractionate the blood into the different cholesterol, so LDL and HDL and intermediate density lipoproteins, IDL and triglycerides, and that's where we got good cholesterol and bad cholesterol. So the 5 studies around the country, including Hawaii, did this in Framingham, the famous Framingham heart study. In January 1977, they published 2 papers, one on Framingham alone and one on all 5 studies combined as a meta-analysis. And the result was that total cholesterol was meaningless. Okay, so your total cholesterol number could never get measured again, and it's going to have zero effect on your life. LDL cholesterol and triglycerides were both marginal predictors of risk. Marginal was the word they used. And HDL cholesterol was far and away the best predictor. And the best predictor in, LDL had no predictive power over the age of 50, which is when most of us get heart disease,
right.
And no predictive power in women. HDL had predictive power at all times, and the higher the HDL, the healthier you were. And it was 4 times as accurate a predictor of heart disease as LDL.
Right.
Okay. So what's your HDL cholesterol?
That's the critical. I forget what my numbers are. My HDL was pretty good. That's the good cholesterol, right? The HDL is the good cholesterol.
Yeah, and that goes up with exercise.
Yeah, mine was pretty high. But the LDL was also high. So my doc goes, you should take a 10 milligram statin. And I'm like, all right. So I start doing this, then I get cramping when I'm riding. And it's like, okay, I stop that. Then I go back on. And I'm in conflict about it. Most of my docs, of course, say, you should just take it like you take a baby aspirin. Just take it as a preventative measure. Well, I don't know. Maybe.
That's what, and I feel the same. I talk about in the book because I have last time I looked 5 years ago, I had a high LDL cholesterol, and I say doctors I know and respect would tell me not to worry about it.
Yeah.
Because it's not predictive. It's not predictive for people who have HDL as high as mine and triglycerides who don't have metabolic syndrome in effect.
Yeah.
And then I have doctor friends I respect who would say what your doctor's told to you. Look, take a benign low-dose statin. Lipitor is cheap. What do you have to lose? If you have a side effect, we'll find you a different one. If you have muscle soreness or, I choose not to because I don't have a family history of heart disease. If I was in your shoes, I would probably
Here's my numbers.
Err on the side of caution.
Yeah, let's see. My cholesterol, this was February 2018. 247 was my overall. They tell you it's supposed to be below 200. Although I remember when this shifted, it used to be 220 when I was at Kaiser, like in my 30s, and I was always around 210. And they go, oh, you're okay. And then they changed the level. You have to be below 200. I'm like, and I was still at 210. They go, now you have to take the statin. I'm like, well, okay. So anyway, HDL 59, supposed to be above 40. So I'm good there. Triglycerides 82, supposed to be below 150. So I'm good there. LDL supposed to be below 100. I'm 169. So that's what my doc says. Okay. LDL is too high. Boom.
That's all they care about.
Right.
Again, considering your family history, I would, if you could find a statin. But again, I have people in my world would say I'm insane to say this. I'll get crucified if they listen to this, With the family history, I'm going to err on the side of caution.
Yeah.
Right? What do you, again, you could, if your HDL is 59 without a ketogenic, you could switch to a ketogenic diet and you might bump that another 20 points. And then I would say you're never going to die of a heart attack. But I would still, it's just a different situation. It's part of the formula.
Right.
That I, what I often do is I recommend there are these cholesterol risk calculators, like the American College of Cardiology has one, the AHA, the American Heart Association, NIH. So you could go to those risk calculators and you could plug in all your numbers. It'll ask you where you're a smoker, what's your weight, your age, your sex, your LDL cholesterol, your blood pressure, and then it'll tell you your 10-year heart disease risk.
Right.
And then you could go back and pretend you're on a statin. So lower your LDL from like 160 to 100. Should be a very effective statin. Yeah. And see how much your risk changes. Right. But again, it doesn't ask for family history, and it should. So that family history is, to me, is all the rest is kind of irrelevant. I would err on the side of caution.
Let's go through
great phrase these days.
Let's go through just a handful of the things we should be eating and what we should be avoiding on the keto diet. So,
and again, this is about the idea is carbohydrate-rich foods are fattening. Right. So those of us who fatten easily, those of us who are getting diabetic, those of us who have high blood pressure, the problems of the carbohydrate content of our diet.
So pasta, rice, what about
potatoes, cereals,
granola? What about like
granola,
steel cut?
The sugar content?
I know. I eat granola because it's like dessert, and I know that's why I know I should not be eating this.
One of the great disappointments of my adult life was when I looked at the nutrient content of a granola box of like Swiss muesli in 1996 and realized that it had as much sugar as
a scoop of ice cream.
I was like, Jesus, why did I look?
But what about cereals like steel cut oatmeal that has no sugar in it? But then
the phrase I use in the book, which dates to 1825, and the single most famous book ever written about food, was called The Physiology of Taste by a Frenchman named Jean-Antoine Briot-Savarin, and he said, people get fat because of the carbohydrates, and if they don't want to be fat, you need more or less rigid abstinence to the carbohydrate content of the diet. So if you're 10 pounds overweight and you want, maybe less rigid abstinence is necessary. So you go from eating Special K to eating steel ground oats because it takes longer to digest the oats. And so you'll get a slower blood sugar rise and a more moderate insulin response. And the insulin will come down more quickly. So you can improve the quality of the carbs you eat and get rid of the sugars. Because I think everyone's going to be healthier if they get rid of the sugars. If you have a severe weight problem, then you have to minimize your insulin levels, and then you're not eating any of these foods. And then you're eating, again, it's not as drastic as it sounds. So lunch, like you're eating whatever you have for lunch anyway without the bread.
Yeah.
You mentioned the bread and breakfast, without the potatoes.
Breakfast, either steel cut oatmeal or maybe bacon and eggs. Bacon and eggs is okay, which I was glad to read that because I love bacon and eggs. But no toast.
Yeah. Or
right?
you
no
do
toast.
the intermittent fasting and you don't eat the breakfast either.
Right.
But that's the thing. No. So
but I could eat bacon and eggs for lunch.
That a healthy. And you could do that. I know people who do that.
I do that.
And I do it on occasion. I love bacon and eggs, right?
Yeah.
But the nutritionists will say any diet that allows bacon is an unhealthy diet. There's a crazy, like I said, we can have this wonderful conversation where we're in a complete agreement. Everybody thinks, boy, that Taubes guy sounds really smart, right? But the world is full of dietitians and nutritionists who will label a diet as unhealthy because it contains bacon. And they won't know why. They'll have read somewhere that bacon, it's got nitrates. Broccoli has nitrates too, but those must be different nitrates. Broccoli has more nitrates. I described there's two different definitions of healthy at work here. So the conventional wisdom is a healthy diet is fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, lean meat in moderation, no processed meats, fish.
Yeah.
And we think that diet's healthy because we think if you eat it, you'll live longer.
Yeah.
And this is what lean, healthy people tend to eat because this is also what they've been told to eat for the last 50 years. And lean, healthy people tend to be health conscious, so they do what they've been told. The other diet is, this eggs and bacon for breakfast thing with meat, not just meat, but processed meat. Like you could have bologna if you want, or pancetta, or, pick your European processed meat and green vegetables. So one diet is sort of diet by hypothesis. If you eat this, we think you'll live longer, and we'll have no way to know if you will or not. And the other one, the eggs and bacon one, is diet by experience. If you eat this, you will get healthier. So the dietitians and nutritionists who are trained in the hypothesis will tell you that you're killing yourself because you're eating the bacon, but you'll be getting healthier. I use in the chapter discussing this, I quote an Instagram post from a woman named, a real estate agent named Rochelle, who I think Wisconsin, Rochelle Plotz. And she said, she was 340 pounds, and then she went on keto. And she lost 110 pounds. It got to 230. And she said, I've lost 110 pounds. And now my friends complain about the bacon I eat. They think I'm killing myself because of my bacon. They never commented about what I was doing to myself when I weighed 340. But at 230,
right,
they're worried about the bacon. And they think, it's like
right.
She's healthier. We know she's healthier. In part because she's 110 pounds lighter.
Right.
But we've been taught to think this is an unhealthy way to eat. And the reason I wrote this book is to try and sort of begin this process of reprogramming. Yeah. If you eat this way and you get healthier, that's all you have to know. We can measure these health risks. We can do your lipids and your HDL and triglycerides and your insulin and blood sugar and your weight is a good marker of health. Right. Your doctor will tell you it's the most important marker of health, as long as you don't eat bacon.
So nuts, cashews, almonds, avocado. These are good fats.
Avocado's fine. Nuts are borderline. It kind of depends. When I talk to the physicians who really been doing this the longest, who have clinics dedicated to these low carb, high fat ketogenic diets. They think the way they all describe it is people tend to over consume nuts. But as a general rule, the better the nut tastes, the more carbs are in it.
Yes, I know. Cashews are the best.
So you get
I know they're really fattening.
cashews are tasted. Yeah. So, and then you know, and again, this is how you learn to think. One of the messages here, people will say, well, these diets are impossible to sustain. Nobody can sustain eating this way, which is crazy because the world is full of, probably a few million people who do.
Yeah.
But the idea is it takes work. It takes practice. Like anything in your life, it takes practice to eat well, period. To be a good chef takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
To eat healthy, to be a vegetarian takes a lot of work and a lot of practice and a knowledge of where you can get the foods you eat. And so this does too, and the more you do it, the better you get at it.
Yeah.
And you begin to see triggers. So if I have a food where, I go and I have a small handful of cashews, and then before I leave the kitchen, I turn around and get another handful of cashews,
right.
I'm going to start wondering whether the cashews are a good idea.
Right.
And I'm pretty confident that if I stop eating cashews, I won't miss them. Because I've seen this happen. Again, I have 20 years of experience. I used to love pasta. I can't imagine eating pasta today. I used to love fresh orange juice.
I love pasta. Pasta with fish or, like a seafood fettuccine is really good. But the seafood is fine, but not the fettuccine, eh?
Well, that's the point, yeah. So one of the early adjustments I made, we were still living in Manhattan when I first tried Atkins as an experiment. And I used to my local Italian restaurant, and I'd get 2 side orders of meatballs instead of meatballs with spaghetti. I love meatballs with spaghetti, but the truth is I love meatballs. So I can live without the spaghetti. And after a few weeks, this is where it helps to have been a cigarette smoker. So when you quit smoking,
that's funny,
which I tried to do virtually every day from age 21 to age 40 when I finally succeeded.
Wow.
There's a 3-week period where you're absolutely miserable.
Yeah.
I mean, the first 3 weeks are just, you are craving cigarettes all day long. You're depressed. Your temper is vile. You can't think straight. And after about 3 weeks, the worst of it passes. And I've heard the same said about getting off alcohol. And then there's about a 1-year period where it's just this, you can't moderate your emotions correctly because you use cigarettes to basically as a resistor in the currents in your system. You get too happy, you smoke a cigarette. You get too sad, you smoke a cigarette. I had to explain to my friends when I finally successfully quit, even though I was using nicotine gum, that, if I lose my temper or I overreact to something, please forgive me. This seems to be happening a lot these days. At the end of a year, that period tends to fade, and now you just go into sort of general malaise. But after 2 or 3 years, it's like you can't really understand why you ever smoked, and you don't miss it anymore. And it's not like your life has diminished one iota, the fact that you're not doing something you couldn't imagine not doing 3 years earlier. I mean, it's fat. If you go to a bar and drink too much alcohol, cigarettes are going to be a threat and a risk, and you may take it up again and convince yourself. So you have to avoid situations that trigger you. But for the most part, out of sight is out of mind. You just you become a non-smoker.
So you don't miss.
I became.
You don't miss pasta. You don't miss granola anymore. You just stop craving it.
No, you just stop. I mean, if I go out to eat with my wife, who's a mostly vegetarian. There's a wonderful Italian restaurant in our neighborhood in Oakland, and we go on, holiday birthdays and anniversaries. We go to Bilatti's on College Avenue, and my wife gets pasta, and I get duck or something, and then I eat her pasta. And she gets mad at me because I won't keep, but it's delicious pasta. And I know when I go home, I'm not going to have anything worth cheating for.
I see.
And the same thing happens with dessert. But if I'm not at Bilotti, I don't miss it. I don't, there's not a period in my life. I never go downstairs and start cooking dinner for my family, which I do, and think, boy, I wish I could eat the rigatoni tonight.
Yeah.
I might have fond memories of when I did eat rigatoni. And occasionally I think, oh, those were the days. But
Do you make a distinction
I don't do it. The reason I don't do it.
Do you make a distinction between, say, red meat, like a steak, versus chicken versus fish? For keto effectiveness,
I mean, again, it's not really. The idea is you want to get most of your calories from fat, not protein. So you're thinking more in terms of, like I said, if when I go to buy chicken, I get a whole roast chicken, or I'll get chicken thighs. My wife insists on eating skinless chicken breasts, so I'll make those for her and think, thank God I don't have to eat that. So you tend to make those think that way more than, lean fish doesn't satisfy
like maybe
me, so I want
salmon has a lot of fat in it versus, say, a flatfish or something like that.
Yeah, and again, you make decisions. I make decisions based on what I find satiating. I find it hard. I can eat a very expensive amount of fish effortlessly. It doesn't tend to satiate me. Red meat does, but I feel for the animals. I understand the ethical issues with being a meat consumer, and I try to get pasture raised beef because I don't want to feel
factory farming.
Support the So I'm not sure whether it's really healthy or not. I have friends who argue it is, and I think they're smart guys, or men and women, but so you end up making those kinds of decisions. A lot of it is just about, you make a commitment to living healthy, and for being healthy, and healthy for us. Again, the argument is healthy for us means carbohydrate restricted, high fat diets.
Now you also make a distinction between different kinds of fruit. Berries are okay. Maybe apples and bananas. What about bananas? I love bananas.
Bananas are kind of well, you notice with bananas, as they get older, they get sweeter. So as they ripen, they get sweeter. And that's literally, chemical reaction increasing the sucrose, the sugar content of the banana. They're probably the worst fruit.
Oh no!
I used to say, it's high sugar, high starch content. So berries have a low sugar, high fiber content. That's why blueberries, blackberries are considered benign. The more tropical the fruit, the sweeter the fruit, the more you should probably avoid it. Again, this is if for those of us who fatten easily, it's a phrase I use right out of the 1950s diet books. We know who we are. So the argument for us, the carbohydrates are the problem. The easier they are to digest and the sweeter they are, the worse they are for us. And if we don't want to fatten easily, or we want to mobilize and burn the fat we've stored, we have to avoid these foods. Not everyone has to do it. We do. That's the case for keto. We are different than lean people. We know who we are. We're not fat because we eat too much. That's not the problem. It's the carbohydrate content of the diet. And, if you think I'm wrong, try it as an experiment and see what happens. It's a pretty simple argument.
All right. In addition to reading your book, where do you want listeners to go to get more information on all this?
Well, there's a whole world of information out there that I didn't provide, but there are websites like dietdoctor.com, which is a Swedish website, or a website produced by a Swedish physician, is an amazing source of information for, eating low carb, high fat diets. For diabetes.co.uk is an amazing source of information. Ditchthecarbs.com. My website is, at Gary Taubes, at GaryTaubes.com, but I greatly appreciate everybody buying the book. I think it's a very valuable and important book. But, when it comes to, and for recipes, you have to go somewhere else, because I am a lousy cook, and I just think it would be hypocritical. So
that's all right,
but
Gary. We all have to stay in our wheelhouse. No, your work is really important. I know you get hammered and that bothers you. Of course, it bothers all of us. Just don't read the online comments. Quit doing that. Your life will be better. It's like smoking. Quit smoking and don't read the comments on Facebook and Twitter.
Yeah, no, exactly. Michael, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. No, it's always great to have you on, and you always bring a lot of interesting information. I love outsiders to the scientific process like this because they bring in a different voice and they ask questions that people should be asking, and that's okay. That's how it works. All right. So what are you having for dinner tonight?
Yeah, I don't know. I got to cook. Probably. We get these dinner boxes delivered, where they provide the all the ingredients, and it takes 30 minutes to cook it. And I think there's a beef bourguignon that my wife won't eat, so I have to make beef bourguignon for me and my two boys, and probably a fried egg with cream cheese and scallions and toast for my wife.
Whoa, that's quite a combination. Well, I know you're going to go play basketball with your boys and get a good workout in, so I don't want to keep you any longer away from that. Gary, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. Again, love the book.
Thank you for having me.
It's great.